My dad tricked my mom into signing over her business while she was heavily medicated and then handed it to my sister's gambling-addicted husband instead of me. Even though I spent 2 decades working there, it's been 5 years since my mom passed away after a tough battle with ovarian cancer. She was an extraordinary woman who built her interior design business from the ground up, transforming it into one of the most highly regarded firms in our city. From as early as I can remember, I worked alongside her whenever I could, soaking up knowledge about the business. It was always clear that I would eventually take over. Not just because I'm the eldest daughter, but because I invested years into learning the craft and forming relationships with our clients. My mom had started the business in our garage when I was just 5. I can still picture her staying up late, sketching out designs and making calls, all while finding time to help me with my homework. She grew her client base one project at a time, often taking on jobs too small for other designers, treating every client with equal dedication. Whether they were overhauling a mansion or just redecorating a small room. By the time I hit high school, she had expanded into a gorgeous downtown office with a skilled team of designers working under her. I practically grew up in that business. After school, I'd sit in her office to finish my homework, all while listening to her meetings and soaking in everything about design and running a business. By the time I turned 16, I was helping with office admin tasks. At 18, I was already tagging along to client meetings and design expos. Mom ensured I got hands-on experience in every part of the business, from creative design work to managing finances. When I went off to college, I chose a business major and added a minor in interior design. I spent my summers interning at other firms to gain broader experience, but always returned to work with Mom during my breaks. Meanwhile, my younger sister, Rachel, couldn't have cared less about the business. She was all about her social life and eventually married James, a man from a rich family who had never held a real job. While I was dedicating my weekends to client site visits and industry events with Mom, Rachel was busy planning extravagant parties and flaunting her lavish lifestyle on social media. Occasionally, she'd pop into the office, not to contribute, but to borrow money from Mom or brag about her latest shopping spree. Not once did she show any real curiosity about the business or what we did there. Even before James came into the picture, Rachel had always been Dad's favorite. He adored her carefree spirit and outgoing personality. My serious, career-driven nature seemed to remind him of Mom's independence, which I think secretly made him uncomfortable. When Rachel married James, Dad couldn't have been happier. He saw James as the son he'd never had, completely buying into James's grand talk about his supposed business ideas, despite James's history of failed ventures and wasted opportunities. When Mom was diagnosed with cancer, I cut back my hours at my internship so I could help her run the business while she went through treatment. I saw her power through rounds of chemo, still making time to review designs and attend critical client meetings whenever she could. Even on her most difficult days, she stayed connected with her long-term clients. To her, the business wasn't just a company. It was the culmination of her life's work, and she was determined to see it thrive. Even after she was gone, in her final months, Mom made it abundantly clear to everyone, especially my dad, that she wanted me to take over the business. She even worked with her lawyer to draft the paperwork that would officially transfer ownership to me after her passing. I'll never forget sitting by her hospital bed as she walked me through every detail of the company. She shared the names of key clients, supplier contacts, and her long-term vision for the business. She made me promise to uphold the company's reputation for integrity, telling me that I was the only one who truly grasped what she had built. The day before she passed, Mom called me to her hospital room for a private conversation. Even in her weakened state, she was determined to tell me something important. She confessed that James had been visiting her when I wasn't around, trying to convince her to change her will and hand the business over to him. He'd even brought legal documents for her to sign, insisting it would relieve me of the burden of running the company. Mom was livid and had him thrown out of her room. She made me swear that, no matter what, I wouldn't let James get anywhere near her business. Mom also shared her fears about Dad and Rachel. She was worried they might meddle with her plans, knowing how Dad had always shown favoritism toward Rachel and how James had been scheming to insert himself into the company. To protect her wishes, she ensured that all the legal documents were in perfect order and even spoke to her senior employees, asking them to back me during the transition. Everything seemed set for a seamless handover. What I didn't know at the time was that Dad had already betrayed her trust. While she was still battling cancer in the hospital, he had been secretly meeting with lawyers to figure out how to challenge her will. He even went into her office late at night, rummaging through her files, taking documents, and making copies of contracts. Rachel was part of this betrayal, using the spare key Mom had given her, for emergencies only, to help Dad access the office. While Mom was on her deathbed, they were actively plotting behind her back. The day after Mom's funeral, literally the day after we laid her to rest, Dad called a meeting with the company's lawyers. He couldn't even wait for the flowers on her grave to wilt. That's when I discovered the full extent of his treachery. Although Mom had carefully documented her intentions to leave the business to me, Dad had spent months quietly building a legal case against her wishes. He dug up the original incorporation papers from when the company was founded 25 years earlier. Back then, Mom had listed Dad as a 50% co-owner for tax purposes, even though his involvement was limited to basic bookkeeping. This was a common arrangement for married couples at the time, and Mom had trusted him completely. During her illness, Mom had tried to update those documents to reflect her true ownership of the business, but Dad deliberately stalled the process. He claimed he was too overwhelmed by her medical care to handle the paperwork. In reality, he was meeting with corporate attorneys who specialized in hostile takeovers, plotting to take control of the business the moment Mom was gone. What completely shattered me was discovering what happened during Mom's final days in the hospital. Dad waited until she was at her most vulnerable, just 2 days before she passed. When the doctors had significantly increased her morphine to manage her pain, he showed up alone after visiting hours, using his status as her husband to bypass the nurses. One of Mom's regular nurses later told me she had tried to stop him, arguing that Mom needed rest, but he insisted it was urgent. He brought a pile of documents, claiming they were critical insurance forms needed to secure her last round of treatments. Mom, barely able to hold a pen, signed multiple pages. At that point, she was heavily medicated and trusted the man she'd been married to for over 30 years. A night nurse who was present during the signing, because she believed these were medical papers, recalled that Mom kept asking questions. Dad brushed her off, rushing her through it and insisting there wasn't time to go over everything since the insurance office needed them first thing in the morning. Those papers turned out to be a complete transfer of her shares to Dad, along with documents granting him power of attorney. The signatures were barely legible, shaky lines that looked nothing like the confident signature I had seen on countless client contracts. But Dad had been calculating. He had the nurse sign as a witness and brought along a notary who wasn't familiar with Mom's usual signature. It was underhanded but technically legal. I only found out about this because the nurse, feeling guilty, reached out to me after Mom passed. She realized too late that something about the situation wasn't right. Of course, I tried to fight it. I spent over $50,000 of my savings on lawyers. Every one of them told me the same thing. While Dad's actions were morally appalling, they were legally sound. The fact that he was listed as a co-owner in the original incorporation papers, combined with the documents he tricked Mom into signing, gave him just enough legal ground to take control. When I presented Mom's recent will and the updated transfer documents she prepared, Dad's lawyers argued that her mental state in her final months, due to the heavy medication, made those documents invalid. Conveniently, they defended the papers Dad had her sign under the exact same conditions. Then Dad delivered the ultimate betrayal. He announced he was handing over control of the business to James, my sister's husband. His justification? The business needs a man's touch, and James has an MBA. This, despite James's entire track record being nothing but failed ventures and squandering his trust fund. Meanwhile, I had spent my whole life learning the ins and outs of this business, yet my experience was completely disregarded. The announcement was made at a company-wide meeting. I sat there, humiliated, as Dad heaped praise on James for his so-called fresh perspective and modern business acumen. Employees who had seen me grow up in the business looked on in stunned silence. James had the audacity to say, "I understand some of you might be apprehensive about the changes, but I promise to honor Sarah's legacy." Hearing those words felt like a slap in the face. Not only had they ignored Mom's explicit wishes, but they had completely dismissed the years I had dedicated to the company. Dad didn't even bother to tell me about his decision in advance. I found out at the same time as everyone else. The smug grin on Rachel's face during the announcement said it all. She had been fully involved in this betrayal. What made it even harder to stomach was learning later that James had already been plotting behind the scenes, promising some of Mom's longtime employees special treatment if they supported his takeover. He'd been secretly meeting with them, offering raises and promotions to secure their backing over mine. While most of them refused and came straight to me with what he'd been doing, a handful actually sided with him. These were people who had worked alongside Mom for decades, who had watched me grow up in the business, and now they were suddenly treating James like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs. I was crushed, not just by their betrayal of Mom's wishes, but by the sheer inevitability of what would happen next. I knew James was going to destroy the business. He had no real knowledge of design, no connection to our clients, and absolutely no regard for the legacy Mom had poured her heart into building. During transition meetings, he kept throwing around buzzwords about modernizing and disrupting the company, completely disregarding the reputation and relationships Mom had cultivated over decades. Rachel, of course, was fully in her husband's corner. She brushed off my concerns, calling me dramatic and saying I should just be happy for their success. Her indifference to everything Mom had worked for left me seething. I couldn't bear to watch them dismantle Mom's life's work, so I handed in my resignation. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. Several key employees said they wanted to follow me out the door, and some were even in tears when I told them I was leaving. But I urged them to stay, knowing they had families to support. A few even offered to quit in solidarity, but I told them that Mom would have wanted them to protect their livelihoods if they could. After leaving, I packed up my life and moved to a new city, determined to start over. I launched my own design consulting business from scratch, pouring everything I had into building it. It wasn't easy, but Mom had taught me well. For the next 3 years, I kept contact with my family to a minimum. Dad would occasionally call to berate me, complaining that I was being ungrateful, while Rachel sent passive-aggressive messages accusing me of abandoning the family. I ignored them and focused on my work. Slowly but surely, I built up a strong client base and a solid reputation in my new city. Word got around to some of Mom's old clients that I had started my own firm, and a few of them sought me out, eager to work with me again. Their support gave me the boost I needed to establish myself faster than I had imagined. Then, just last month, I got a panicked call from Rachel. It turned out everything I had predicted about James had come true. He had driven Mom's company into the ground. He'd taken out massive loans for unnecessary expansions, alienated long-term clients with his arrogance, and eventually resorted to embezzling funds to cover his gambling debts. The business was now on the brink of bankruptcy, and James was potentially facing criminal charges. What made it even harder to stomach was finding out later that James had been secretly meeting with several of Mom's longtime employees before the takeover. He promised them promotions and pay raises if they backed his leadership instead of mine. Most of them refused and came to me to share what he'd done, but a few actually sided with him. These were people who had worked alongside Mom for decades, people who had watched me grow up in that office, and yet here they were, suddenly treating James like he was some kind of design world savior. I wasn't just heartbroken over how Mom's wishes had been betrayed. I was terrified for the future of the business. James didn't have the slightest clue about design, no relationships with our clients, and no regard for the legacy Mom had spent her life building. During the transition meetings, he kept throwing around buzzwords like modernization and disruption, completely ignoring the reputation and trust Mom had worked so hard to cultivate. Rachel, of course, stood by him without question. When I voiced my concerns, she dismissed me as being dramatic and said I should be happy for their success. The sheer arrogance of it all was unbearable. I couldn't stand by and watch them destroy everything Mom had built, so I resigned on the spot. Some of the key employees threatened to follow me out the door, but I encouraged them to stay, knowing they had families to take care of. A few of them cried when I told them I was leaving, and several even offered to quit in solidarity. But I knew that Mom would have wanted me to protect their jobs if I could. I packed up my life and moved to another city, starting over completely. From scratch, I built my own design consultancy. It was grueling at first, but everything I knew, I had learned from Mom, and I carried her principles into my new business. For the next 3 years, I had almost no contact with my family. Dad would call occasionally to berate me for being ungrateful, and Rachel sent passive-aggressive messages accusing me of abandoning the family. Meanwhile, I focused entirely on my work. Slowly but surely, I built a reputation and a solid client base in my new city. Word got around to some of Mom's old clients that I had started my own firm, and many of them sought me out. Their loyalty and support helped me get established far faster than I'd expected. Then, just last month, Rachel called me in a complete panic. It turns out James had done exactly what I predicted. He had driven Mom's business into the ground. He had taken out enormous loans for unnecessary expansions, alienated long-term clients with his condescending attitude, and eventually started embezzling money to cover his gambling debts. Now, the business was on the brink of bankruptcy, and James was facing possible criminal charges. The part that truly enraged me was learning that James had been using the company's reputation, Mom's name, to secure loans and contracts, only to fail spectacularly at delivering what was promised. The damage he'd done wasn't just financial. He had tarnished the trust and goodwill Mom had spent decades cultivating with her clients. And what did they do when it all fell apart? They blamed me. Dad called me in tears, claiming that if I had stayed to help James learn the business, none of this would have happened. Rachel insisted that I had an obligation to come back and fix things because Mom would have wanted you to save her company. The audacity of their demands was staggering. They had forced me out and dismissed all of my experience and hard work, and now they wanted me to drop everything and save the business they had stolen from me. James even had the nerve to suggest I could come back and work as a senior consultant. Under him, I refused outright. I told them they made their choice when they pushed me aside and disregarded Mom's clear wishes. I've built something of my own, something I'm proud of, and I won't abandon it to clean up their mess. The irony is, many of Mom's former clients are already working with me because they know I uphold the same standards and integrity she did. This has caused a massive rift in the family. Dad has been telling anyone who will listen that I'm letting Mom's legacy die out of spite. Rachel has taken to social media, posting about how I've betrayed the family and abandoned Mom's dream. Even some longtime family friends have reached out, urging me to put aside my pride to preserve what Mom built. What Rachel doesn't realize is that 3 major design firms have already approached me about buying out what's left of Mom's company. They know about the financial troubles and are circling like vultures. I could probably work out a deal that would preserve the company's name and save jobs for the remaining employees. But it would mean Dad and James facing the consequences of their actions. I've been sitting on these offers, torn about what to do. Part of me wants to see them crash and burn for what they've done. But then I think about the employees who stayed loyal and the legacy Mom worked so hard to create. This morning, as I was reviewing one of the buyout proposals, Dad called. He was crying, something I've only witnessed twice before. Once when Mom was diagnosed, and again at her funeral. He was practically sobbing, going on about how he should have listened to Mom when she warned him about James. He admitted he'd made a terrible mistake and how everything was falling apart. But do you know what struck me the most? Despite all his blubbering and apologizing, not once did he actually acknowledge what he'd done to me. He wasn't sorry for betraying me or ignoring Mom's wishes. He was just upset that his plan had failed so spectacularly. Then he started talking about ways to fix everything. Even now, with the company on the verge of collapse, he still believes James should remain in charge. He even had the audacity to suggest that I come back to mentor James and help him become a better businessman. Can you believe that? As if the issue was just a lack of coaching, not the fact that James has been committing fraud and gambling with company funds. Dad kept throwing around phrases like, "We're still family, and we need to stick together." But where was all this talk about family loyalty when they were stealing Mom's business from me? After learning more from Lisa and Mr. Chun, I decided to consult with my lawyer. She strongly advised me to document everything to protect myself, especially since James's fraudulent activities could eventually lead to legal investigations that might affect anyone who's ever been connected to the company. While we were discussing the situation, she mentioned that one of her other clients, a forensic accountant, had been hired by some of Mom's old clients to dig into where their deposits had gone. These clients took action after James repeatedly failed to provide clear answers about their projects. Apparently, this accountant has already uncovered proof of at least 6 instances of blatant fraud. Lisa has been quietly helping by passing along copies of financial records showing how James has misappropriated company funds. Among the documents is evidence of a business trip to Paris that was actually a vacation with another woman, someone who is definitely not Rachel. For now, I'm keeping the mistress situation to myself. At the rate things are unraveling, Rachel will probably find out soon enough. In the meantime, I'm carefully documenting everything but staying as far away from the chaos as I can while my own business is thriving. I just secured a major contract that Mom always dreamed of landing, and I did it entirely on my own. Several of her former clients have reached out to me, saying they see in me the same integrity and attention to detail that made Mom so unique. It's been 6 months since my last update, and things have finally reached their breaking point. Those clients who hired the forensic accountant ended up suing James and the company. Once the lawsuit hit, everything unraveled. The gambling debts, the embezzlement, and all the rest. James tried to skip town, but it seems the people he owed money to got to him first. He landed in the hospital with a broken arm and a couple of cracked ribs. Rachel showed up on my doorstep at 2 a.m. that same night, crying, visibly pregnant, and finally aware of the full extent of James's lies. She had found paperwork in their house, proof of the remortgage, his gambling debts, and even receipts for his trips with the mistress. I let her stay with me for a few days while she processed everything. She bounced between anger at James and guilt for not realizing what was happening sooner. Dad didn't escape the fallout either. He had a minor heart attack when the truth came out. He's recovering now, but seeing him in the hospital really drove home just how old and worn down he's become. The doctors said stress played a major role. While he was there, he apologized to me again, and this time, it felt genuine. He finally acknowledged not only the recent mess with James, but also how deeply he had betrayed both me and Mom by disregarding her wishes. It might have been too late to repair things completely, but at least it was honest. The company is being sold, but not to any of the design firms I'd mentioned before. Once they saw how dire the financial situation was, they all pulled out. Instead, one of Mom's former employees managed to pull together a group of investors to buy the remnants of the business. They're starting fresh under a new name. They even invited me to join as a partner, but I declined. I did agree to act as a consultant, though, and I'm helping them reconnect with some of Mom's old clients. Rachel has filed for divorce. For now, she's moved back in with Dad. Losing the house isn't a done deal anymore. The bank is working with them to restructure the mortgage since they've been able to prove James committed fraud. She's due to give birth any day now. Despite everything that's happened, I've been helping her get the nursery ready. I know Mom would have wanted me to do that. As for James, he's facing criminal charges for fraud. His lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but it looks like he's headed to prison. The evidence against him is overwhelming, especially after Lisa handed over all the documentation she had been quietly collecting. Apparently, she had been keeping detailed records from the day James took over, almost as if she had known this day would come. Meanwhile, my business has been thriving. I recently purchased a gorgeous old building downtown, which I'm in the process of renovating to become my company's new headquarters. This feels like the end of this chapter of my life, and I'm ready to move forward. I probably won't update again. From here on, it's about focusing on building something entirely my own and writing the next part of my story.